We're in a study of the Gospel of Luke. We're working our way through it verse by verse. And today we come to one of Jesus' very most famous, but also most challenging teachings: to love our enemies. So let's get right into it, shall we? Because this is a tough text for us, for me as your pastor to bring. It seems to me that any time that a pastor comes and talks about loving your enemies is when he's got a point to make, about there's some enemy of his or within the church. And it seems like that loses a little bit of credibility. We're just coming along this verse because this happens to be where we are. So this week, I want you to know I was really challenged, and I hope that you are really challenged by this passage here. The first thing we learned today is that loving the unlovable is the central command of Christianity. It's the central command. You want to know what Christianity is all about? Boy, you come right here. This is the main part of the main sermon that Jesus preaches, central command. He says this in verse 27 and 32, love your enemies. If you love those who love you, which is what we do, right? You love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. Jesus actually teaches us that we are to love people who do not in turn love us back, who not only don't intentionally love us, but sometimes who want to cause harm to us, people who want to hurt us. And this is, like I say, one of the most famous teachings of Jesus, but at the same time, can I just be honest with you? I think this is one of the most difficult to live out, personally. When we come to this, as I've heard other people who have taught about this or who have talked about this, it seems like Christians often have one of three choices that they use when they come to this. The first choice of how they grasp a hold of this is that Jesus is using a form of hyperbole for the children here. The word hyperbole, you want to learn a new word? Hyperbole simply means when you use exaggeration to make a point. And so he's using hyperbole here. He's using exaggeration. He didn't really mean this literally. This is hyperbole. Sometimes people say, secondly, that this is really an unattainable goal. This is something that we should aspire to. This is something that we should aim for. But it's not something that any reasonable person could really accomplish in their life. And then a third way of how people have approached this passage is that we are to attain it somehow, but in the process of loving the unlovable, that we simply become rug mats, and that we let people just run all over us, letting people do anything they want to us, and that's their vision of what this passage is. Well, can I tell you that I believe that all three of those alternatives are incorrect, which leaves us struggling and scratching our heads a little bit. In the first case, about the hyperbole, about the exaggeration, Jesus was never against using hyperbole. He used exaggeration quite a bit in his teaching, but here his teaching is just too specific, with example after example of what he meant, which we're going to look at here in a moment. So if he didn't really mean it, I don't think he would have followed up with all the examples. You see what I'm saying? And secondly, to conclude that this loving our enemies is an exaggeration and an aspiration, something that we should aim for but that we can't really ever achieve, that diminishes what many Christians throughout history have done, and as a result have changed history with a love for their enemies that has just been so remarkable. I could sit here and tell you the history of Christian after Christian after Christian. I'll just give you a few examples. In the very first century, about 100 AD, there was a guy by the name of Ignatius who was en route to Rome, and he knew it. Everybody knew it. He was on the way to be martyred. He was going to be sacrificed to the lions in the Roman theater. And yet, the Roman guards who took him were marveled at his love for them. And this trip to Rome from where he was at took close to a year. And he wrote 7 different letters that are some of the most historical and love-filled letters that we know from the early church. Ignatius changed and kept the Christian faith going. We get to about the 3rd century A.D. We come across a pastor by the name of Dionysius. And the greatest enemy in the 3rd century, believe it or not, was illness. You might survive everything else. You might survive the Roman sword, but you wouldn't survive illness. And yet here was a guy who loved his enemy, illness, so much that he treated the sick. He was an enemy. He treated the sick who were an enemy to his own health. And as a result, Dionysius is the father of hospitals, what we know as hospitals today. He changed history because of his Christian faith. Now, I could do this every single century, but since we don't have, 20 minutes to go through the history of Christianity, let me fast forward to this century, because all of you know the famous story of Agnes Bogiahia. You've all heard of Agnes, right? Her father was likely poisoned for being an Albanian civil rights activist. And you've all heard of Agnes, right? I mean, her response was to care for the very people, and there were many, many others besides that, but to the very people who took her father away, she showed them love. The enemy of her father, the enemy of her family, who left her stranded, she used her Christian love to love your enemy. You all have heard of Agnes, right? Oh, you know what? Maybe you don't know her by her given name. You might know her by her Catholic name, otherwise known as Mother Teresa. Okay? So to simply say that this is a teaching that we are to aspire to, but that we could never achieve, would be to take away the history of Christianity, which isn't so. And then what about this rug mat theory? Can I just tell you that anybody who knows the story of Jesus would have to conclude that he was anything but a rug mat, right? No one could claim that Jesus was a rug mat to anyone, and yet he lived out the love your enemy instructions perfectly. He not only taught it, but he lived it. So we can't say that this is just hyperbole. We can't say that just is something we aspire to but couldn't achieve. We really can't say this is to be lived out by being a rug mat. So how do we respond to this? Okay, we could just quit here. I could go home. Leave you all wondering what. Let's talk about this in 3 ways, all right? First of all, let's talk about what this love is not. Sometimes it helps us to know what something is not, to know what something is. And then secondly, let's consider exactly what this love is. So we'll talk about what it's not. Secondly, we'll talk about what it is. And then third, to give you some real meat to chew on this week, we're going to talk about some practical ways to live out this reality of loving the unlovable. Does that sound like a plan? You all aboard? All right, let's talk first of all about what this love is not. First of all, what this love is not is a feeling only. This is not a feeling only. In our modern day usage of the word love, we wrap this word love up in our emotions. We can't really love someone unless we feel like we love them, right? Love is a feeling, and feelings are important. But when it comes to loving the way Jesus here tells us to love, and he says to love even our enemies, it's really not the most important thing. Feelings of love, we're going to learn today, follow acts of love, not the other way around. This love is not just a feeling. Secondly, it's not just an attitude. Sometimes we think of love as an attitude. Loving our enemies, not just a good motto here. This is not just an attitude of mind that we're supposed to have. Like feelings, it's also possible for us to not have an attitude of love and yet still love. And the attitude comes. The feelings come. We're going to learn that this is more of an act. It's more of a decision. It's more of a correct will than it is having the right attitude. So do I want the right attitude? Yes. But to hear Jesus teach it, it starts with choice, not with attitude. And then thirdly, what this love is not is human origin. This is not a human love that Jesus is talking about. And this isn't to excuse it. This isn't to take it out of the realm of possibility for it. Ultimately, though, we have to come to the conclusion that to love the unlovely, to even love our enemies, to love those who don't even come close to loving us back, is not a natural human response. And so when you don't feel like it and you don't have the right attitude, you say, well, okay, that's it. I'm human. I get that. But yet, Jesus teaches that that's not an excuse. It's really only going to happen when God is in control of my life, when God is in control of your life. You see, the source of this love is God. The source of this kind of love that can love your enemies, that can love the unlovable, is God. In fact, Jesus in this passage tells us that demonstrating this kind of love is actually the number one indicator of authentic Christianity. Did you know that? Let's take a look at it. We read this in the back half of verse 35 and 36. He says this, you will be children of the Most High, talking about God. You will be a child of God. You will be children of the Most High because He is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. In other words, that's what God does. Be merciful. You be merciful just as your Father in heaven is merciful to you. So do you see what Jesus is saying here? Are you picking up what He's laying down? You love people who don't love you back, and you demonstrate that you really are children of God because God is in you, and God's love is in you. And you can do things because of God and God's love in you that you could not do in your own humanness, because that's the kind of thing that God does. He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. He is merciful to people who absolutely do not deserve it. And can I just say, even though you're all bright and shiny, and I love you all here, not a single one of you deserved His love either, and yet God still loved you, right? So, let's dig a little bit deeper here to really grasp this idea of what kind of love this is. And we're going to talk about it here in this moment, but we got to grab hold of this word, this Greek word that is used for love. It's called agape. Up on the screen you have both the Greek spelling, which I know you don't get at all, and then kind of the English transliteration, agape. When Luke is translating Jesus' instructions, he's using the word agape in this teaching so that we might better understand it. Now, we're all English speakers here, and so we struggle with this a little bit. When we use the word love, we can use the word love for a lot of different things, don't we? And it has a lot of different meanings. I say I love Christ. We kind of know what we mean by that, right? I can say I love Mary Kay back there. She's my wife. We're going on, I better not say how many years. I think it's 36, 37, something like that. I got to do the math in my head. 1979. I love my wife. But that's a little bit of a different love than I love Christ, right? But we use the same word. I say, I love my brother Todd. But that's yet another kind of love, right? I say, and some of you saw it last night, I love pizza. But wait, is that the same kind of love that I have for Christ and for my wife and for my brother? I can say, I love the Cleveland Browns. And we can see that's an entirely different love. Right? And yet we use this word love for all of these things. So when Luke is writing this, he is fortunately writing with the language of Greek. And the Greeks had multiple different meanings for love. And he uses the word agape, love. He says, agape, love your enemy. Agape. So what does he have in mind here with agape? Agape is the love of evaluation and choice. Agape is the love of will and action. It is the noblest word for love. Let me say that again to you so that you can get it. If you're going to be writing something down, this might be something you would write down. This agape love is based on evaluation and choice. It's a matter of will and action. It is the noblest word for love. So whenever the Bible talks about the love of Christ or the love of God, here when he's talking about the love that we're supposed to have for others, this is the kind of love it means. Not phileo love, which is the companionable love. Philadelphia love, love your brother kind of love. He's not talking about that kind of love. He's not talking about storge love, the love of natural affection that a mother might have for a child when the child is born. It's not storge love. He's not talking about a love of eros love, the kind of love that I might have for Mary Kay, and hopefully that she still has for me, right? I'm not talking about erotic love. This is a different kind of love. This is a love based on evaluation and choice. A love of sacrifice. So let's talk about that and get some more definition here of what kind of love we're supposed to have for our enemies, for those who don't love us back. First of all, we see that godly love is doing acts of love regardless of my feelings. Godly love is doing acts of love regardless of my feelings. Let's see where we get this from in verse 27, 28, and 30. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Give to everyone who asks you. Notice that in every single example that Christ gives us here, Jesus is giving us an action, not a feeling. Do you see that? Do good, action. Bless, action. Pray, action. Give, action. And notice what it doesn't say here, right? It doesn't say do good to those who hate you when you feel like it. It doesn't say here bless those who curse you when you feel like cursing them back. Right? It doesn't say pray for those who mistreat you even though you want to hurt them back, when that's what your feeling is. Give to everyone who asks you, even though you don't want to give back to them. In other words, it has nothing to do with feelings. It doesn't have anything really here even to do about your attitude. It says just do it anyway. It really would be like the original Nike commercial. Do it. That's what this kind of love is. Another way of saying this then is do good to those who hate you. When you feel hate back at them, but do good anyway, right? Not about feelings, all about actions. Now, here's the thing about acts of love and feelings. Feelings, most of the time, will follow actions. Not every time, but most of the time. If you start with the choice and the act of love, feelings ultimately could follow. But it's never the other way around. And here's where we struggle so much with this, if you allow your feelings to dictate your actions, hear me here, if you allow your feelings to dictate your actions, then the outcome of your life will always be captive to the emotions of your life. And that is a miserable way to live. Horrible. That's why hatred and acts of hatred always ratchet up from one to another. I feel hatred toward you, so I act in hatred toward you. And when I do that, you feel hatred toward me, and you act in hatred toward me. And it is a never-ending spiral that ultimately leads us down to destruction. But God says here, Jesus says here, that there is an agape love. There is a godly love, a love in action that can break the cycle of hatred. So one thing that godly love is doing acts of love regardless of my feelings. A second thing that godly love is choosing acts of love against my instinctive reactions. We have an instinctive reaction that's really bad when someone hurts us, when someone hates us, when someone says something against us. And the only way that I can do acts of love in the face of acts of hatred is when I know I have a choice. When I know I have a choice, that I can choose, that it's possible that I could choose the opposite of what I feel. Here we see it in verse 29. Again, just another clear example of what Jesus has in mind. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Now, this is something so basically, and just, I don't know about you, but when I read this, I so struggle with this. It just viscerally feels deeply wrong. It goes against the grain of my guts in these examples, right? And may I say, it seems to be played out in our political arena these days too, that when someone says something to me, I have to respond back to them, that I would be weak if I didn't do that, okay? Now, here, we see Jesus saying, no, you have a choice. You have a choice in how you respond. And the first and most obvious thing that you want to do when someone hits you is you want to hit them back. Remember from high school? I don't know if kids do this anymore. When I was in high school, we played football. And they actually had a cheer that went something like this. Push them back, harder, harder. They push you push them back. Push you push them back. And when you push them back harder, right? Now, we're taught that when we were kids. If someone robs you, if somebody breaks the law, if somebody steals your coat, we demand justice. Now, the thought of, oh, you want my coat? Well, here, and let me give you my shirt. Also, that just goes against everything that we have been taught about standing up against those who would do us harm. Anybody wondering how in the world I'm going to get out of this today? I mean, I wrote that part, and I said, now what do you write next? What is the next thing you say? Well, I think Jesus knows this. The great thing about Christianity, I think, is that Jesus was fully man. We're not talking about someone here who is never experienced the kind of hatred, the kind of hurt, the kind of anything that you have ever experienced that Jesus hasn't also experienced. He knows that. It was the same in his day. So why? Why do we have this here? Why does he teach this? So that we will know that we do have a choice. That agape love is a love of choice. It is an act of the will. And that responding in like manner, wrong for wrong, is not the only response that we have at our disposal. In fact, Jesus teaches us that it's okay to love back when someone acts in hatred towards us. Not only is it okay, but it's actually the better choice. And acting in love towards the one who hates us, hear me here, is not an act of cowardice. It's actually the other way around. It is an act of great courage. Because anyone can respond with the instinctive, you hate me, I hate you back. It takes someone with great guts and great courage and great conviction to stand there and love in the face of hatred. And sacrifice, because we're talking sacrifice here. This would be the third thing that godly love is. Godly love is sacrificing acts of love, not my selfish inclinations. Because what I want to do is selfish. It always serves my interests. It's always what I think is the best. It's always what makes me feel best. But godly love is actually sacrificing acts of love. Choosing to respond with acts of love in the face of acts of hatred is always sacrificial. Always goes against what we would want to do. Always goes against what we think would be the most natural thing to do. Always goes against our feelings. Always goes against our instincts. Always goes against our inclinations. Do you see why this has to be a godly thing? It's definitely not a human thing. So how do we get it? We see it in verse 31 about how we're supposed to actually do this. Jesus puts it this way: do to others as you would have them do to you. Now, we have watered this down to an out of context, what we call golden rule. Now, don't get me wrong. I want you to teach this to your kids. Kids, I want you to know this. I mean, I think we should live our life by do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's the golden rule. But isn't it interesting, and we don't usually think of it this way, that the place that we learn this golden rule is in the midst of how other people hate us and how we're supposed to love them when they hate us. That's where this passage is at. Do unto others. We usually forget that this is given to us in the middle of how to respond to injustice against us. That this is not to say that there should never be justice, of course. Clearly, God's word speaks to justice. Jesus promises us that there will be a final day of justice for those who love and follow him. But what Jesus reminds us of here is that we must always allow room in our hearts for mercy too. And that is something that only comes from the strength and love of God in our life that gives us the power to act and the power to choose and the power to sacrifice. And so if you're hearing me here today and you say, those are all really good words, but there is no way I can walk out and do what you're talking about, welcome to the club. Because I want you to know this is not something that ever gets easy for anybody, especially your pastor. So how do we actually do this? We've learned what this love is not. It's not a feeling. It's not an attitude. We've learned what it is. It's an act of choice. It's actually doing when we don't feel like it. It's an act of sacrifice. How do we do it? All right, I'm going to give you 4 prescriptions. You've heard of prescriptions, right? These are 4 prescriptions. They all start with the letter P. First thing, practice. Practice. Many of the things that come naturally to me and that come naturally to you, and hatred is one of those things that comes naturally, right? Many of the things that come naturally to us, we could all agree are not good for us. And so we have to practice them to do it right. I naturally will eat sugar all day long. And I do not mean a little bit of sugar. I mean, they brought those M&M's things last night, and they put them like right in front of me while I was doing the computer thing. They were not doing me a favor. Those little kids want to come up and get some M&M's. Those are my M&M's. What are you talking about? I'd eat those Oreo cookies. They played that cookie game last night, and then they put them right in front of me. Oh, my gosh. I've had to learn to discipline myself, and I don't always do it well. Last night was not a good example. To diet, right? And what is diet? Diet is simply practicing eating right. And I've learned, by the way, that this is not something I can do for a limited period of time. I kind of have to practice eating right, apparently, for the rest of my life. And the same thing is true here. It's a lifetime habit. In the same way, I have to practice loving the unlovely. It doesn't come naturally. So how do we practice? How do you practice? By doing things for others that you would want them to do for you on purpose. Practicing, like when we feed the hungry this coming Saturday night. You come show up here at 4 o'clock and watch about 100, 150 people just show up. And I'll tell you, sometimes, I don't know how you feel about this. Should I even just share how your pastor feels? I had a guy last time who came up to me and said, and he's one of the guys coming for the free food, right? What are we having to eat tonight? Now, I have to tell you, I don't always respond with the greatest of affection and love, okay? I said what was the first thing that came to my mind, the first thing that I thought he really needed to hear if he was in line to get the meal. I said food, because we were serving food that night. But he didn't really care about that. He wanted to know what kind of, he found out we're serving tacos, and he left. He wasn't here because he needed to be here. And you know what happens in my head? I have all this negative emotional garbage that goes out against that. But that's not what feeding the hungry is all about. From my standpoint and from your standpoint, it's showing up and practicing doing those things that we don't naturally want to do. Even when someone comes and takes advantage of us, we do it right. We do as we would want someone else to do to us. We practice. When you brought in the pallets full of water for Flint, Michigan a few weeks ago, you were practicing doing unto others what you would have them do unto you. I would hope and pray that if we had problems with lead in our water, that Flint, Michigan might send some water our way. That's what I would want them to do to us. It's a matter of practice. So we have to practice by doing those things. Now, you may think this doesn't really help you dealing with the response to your enemy, but it does. Because the more you act by doing and not just by talking, the more you act by doing, by choosing, especially in a sacrificial way, the more you establish those habits of agape love in your mind. And then the more that they override the ruts of hating back in kind. It changes you when you begin to practice this agape love. You don't naturally love people this way, but once you practice it, those ruts of hatred start to be wiped away in your mind. But you have to be practicing. A second prescription for loving the unlovable is to perceive. Perceive. This kind of love takes a great deal of wisdom. And sometimes the best thing you can do for someone else, sometimes the most loving thing that you can do for someone else is not what they want or not what they say they want. If someone you know is an alcoholic and they come up and they ask you for a beer, you're not loving them by giving them beer. All right? If you know that I have a problem with sugar, giving me M&Ms isn't a good thing for me, right? Even though I will sell you all day, yeah, give it to me. I noticed the other night, we had the ladies over to the house, and they bring all kinds of good sweets over. I love Wednesday nights. They bring all this stuff over. And then there's stuff left over, and Judy had some great stuff the other night, and she had some left over, and she said, should I just leave them? And she looked at me when she said it. And before I could say yes, Mary Kay said, he doesn't need them. Mary Kay loves me. That's called agape love. Do you see what I'm saying? Right? It takes a great deal of perception. So you need perception. You also need to be able to perceive well when your response impacts the safety of your safety or the safety of those who are in your care. Okay, moms especially. If you're in an abusive relationship with someone, you need to know that just letting somebody hurt you is not what Christ has in mind here. That's not what he's talking about. All right? Sometimes it takes a great deal of strength to leave and to take the children away and to go to a place of safety. That's also agape love. Agape love may also be for you to protect those who are the most incapable of protecting themselves. Okay? So one P is to practice, another P is to perceive, a third P is to pray. You knew that was going to be in here, right? You couldn't have a P without pray. But let me just be honest with you here, as honestly as I can. To respond with godly agape love requires a serious connection to the Almighty, because you cannot do this by yourself. You just simply do not have it within you. You don't have the resources to be able to live out this sermon that Jesus gives about loving our enemy. It's just not in your makeup. You need God. You need his eyes. You need his will. You need his wisdom. You need his guidance. You need his Holy Spirit acting in love through you. And you get that through prayer, through connection. So if you're like me and you find that you're more and more irritated and more reacting with a natural, unloving type of thing, you just check back in your head, did I have my prayer time today? Where have I been with my quiet time with the Lord? Am I trying to do this on my own, or is God working in and through me? Is it his power that I'm relying on? That means that the many times in your responses, many times, the response that you have when somebody hurts you, when somebody acts not in love towards you, your response will take time. When you just respond with a knee-jerk response, jerk is the operative word. Right? Sometimes you just need to stop, Maybe you can't do what you think you ought to be able to do in Christian love right that moment, but you can at least stop and get away in prayer and ask God for his help and for his direction. Not a good Christ-like example sometimes because somebody has hurt us and we just hurt them right back. You need to respond with prayer because any other response would just be you acting in your own weakness. And then, the last P. You'll be surprised about this. Party. Party. Absolutely. You want to be able to respond in love to people, you need to be partying more. But now that's a particular kind of party. You might think here that I'm being flippant. What I mean by party is that you have got to involve others in your Christian life walk. You cannot do this on your own. It's much easier to respond in love. It's much easier to respond to acts of injustice when you have brothers and sisters who are standing shoulder to shoulder with you and you're not there alone. God never meant for us to face our enemies alone. He gave us one another that we might practice together with others. He gave us one another when there are times when we need the wisdom and perception of others. He gave us one another so we might be able to see what sometimes we cannot see ourselves. There are times when you need the prayers of others when you cannot pray as well yourself. Now that sound back there was just a little exclamation point that we have come to the end of our talk. This week, will you challenge yourself the next time somebody says or does something that's not just irritating, but is spiteful, hateful, that you'll remember what we talked about today and that you'll try to respond with God's authority and God's power in your life. Let's pray together.